The summer heat shimmered off the cracked asphalt runway like liquid mercury. 15-year-old Sarah Chun dragged a fuel hose toward the weathered Cessna 172. Sweat dripped from her forehead onto the oil-stained concrete of Henderson's Municipal Airport, if you could call a single runway, 2 hangars, and a trailer office an airport. Most people in Millfield, Nebraska, drove past the chain-link fence without a second glance, but Sarah had been mesmerized by this place since she was 8 years old. "You missed a spot on the port wing," called Pete Henderson from beneath the shade of his hangar, a lucky strike dangling from his lips. At 73, Pete had been flying longer than Sarah had been alive. His weathered hands bore the permanent stains of aviation fuel and engine oil, and his eyes held the distant look of someone who'd spent more time in the sky than on the ground. Local legends claimed he'd flown cargo planes over the Himalayas during World War II, though Pete never confirmed or denied the stories. Sarah scrambled up the ladder to scrub the stubborn bug splatter from the wing. For 3 summers, she'd shown up at dawn, willing to do whatever Pete needed, washing aircraft, organizing tools, sweeping hangars, pumping fuel for the occasional visiting pilot. The pay was terrible, 50 cents an hour, when Pete remembered. To pay her at all, but Sarah wasn't there for the money. She was there for the stories, the smell of aviation fuel, and the impossible dream that maybe, someday, she'd get to touch the controls of an actual airplane. "My dad thinks I'm wasting my time out here," Sarah said, wiping down the propeller blades with methodical precision. "He wants me to focus on my studies. Says engineering is a stable career for someone like me." Pete snorted, flicking ash onto the tarmac. "Your old man fixes cars, doesn't he? What's he know about flying?" He paused, studying Sarah with those sharp blue eyes. "Besides, there's more than one kind of engineering. The kind that keeps you on the ground, and the kind that gets you airborne." Sarah's father, David Chun, had immigrated from Taiwan in 1975 with nothing but a mechanical engineering degree and an unshakable belief in the American dream. He'd built Chun's Auto Repair from a single-bay garage into Millfield's most trusted car service, working 16-hour days and saving every penny for Sarah's college fund. In his mind, his daughter's fascination with aviation was a teenage phase she'd outgrow once she discovered the practical realities of life. Her mother, Linda, tried to bridge the gap between her husband's pragmatism and her daughter's dreams. A 3rd-grade teacher at Millfield Elementary, she understood the power of imagination, but also worried about Sarah's fixation on what seemed like an impossible career path. "Honey," she'd say during their evening conversations, "maybe you could teach science instead. You could inspire other children to love aviation." But Sarah didn't want to teach about flying, she wanted to fly. The breakthrough came on a sweltering Tuesday in July. Pete had spent the morning cursing at his ancient Cessna's carburetor, which had been giving him trouble for weeks. Sarah watched him work, handing him tools and absorbing every explanation of how the fuel system operated. When he finally got the engine running smoothly, he stood back and wiped his hands on an oily rag. "You know what this old bird needs?" Pete said, patting the Cessna's fuselage. "A proper test flight to make sure everything's running right." Sarah's heart skipped. She'd watched dozens of flights from the ground, but Pete had never offered to take her up as a passenger. "Thing is," Pete continued, seemingly talking to himself, "my back's been acting up lately. All that bending over the engine. Probably shouldn't be doing any flying today." He tossed the keys to Sarah, who nearly fumbled them in surprise. "Don't kill yourself, kid," Pete muttered, lighting another cigarette. "And don't tell your parents, or the FAA, or anyone else with half a brain." Sarah's hands trembled as she performed the pre-flight inspection Pete had taught her by watching from afar. She checked the fuel levels, inspected the control surfaces, and verified that the propeller blades were secure. Every movement felt surreal, like she was preparing for a dream she might wake up from at any moment. The cockpit of the Cessna was smaller than she'd imagined. With worn leather seats and instruments that looked like they belonged in a museum. Sarah strapped herself in, her heart hammering against her ribs as she ran through the startup checklist. She'd memorized from watching Pete hundreds of times. Clear prop. She called out, though no one was around to hear her. The engine coughed to life, and the propeller began its hypnotic rotation. Sarah taxied to the end of the runway, her hands light on the controls, feeling the airplane respond to her every input. This was it, the moment she'd dreamed about for 7 years. She pushed the throttle forward, and the Cessna began its takeoff roll. The rumble of wheels on asphalt gave way to the smooth sensation of flight as the aircraft lifted into the Nebraska sky. Sarah was alone at 3,000 feet, with nothing but blue sky above and endless farmland below. The tears came suddenly and unexpectedly, not from fear, but from a joy so pure it felt like her chest might burst. She was flying, actually flying. The ground fell away beneath her as she climbed higher, the Cessna responding to her touch like a faithful horse responding to its rider. For 45 minutes, Sarah danced through the clouds above Mill Field. She practiced gentle turns, climbed and descended, and felt the airplane become an extension of her own body. The radio crackled occasionally with distant air traffic, but out here in rural Nebraska, she was alone with her dreams and the endless sky. When she finally landed, Pete was waiting by the hangar, his expression unreadable. "How'd she handle?" he asked gruffly. "Like she was born to fly," Sarah replied, her voice still shaky with emotion. Pete nodded slowly, crushing his cigarette under his boot. "So were you, kid. So were you." That evening, Sarah sat at the dinner table, barely touching her mother's pot roast. Her mind was still at 3,000 feet, reliving every moment of the flight. Her parents chatted about their day. Her father had fixed 3 transmissions. Her mother was preparing for the new school year, but Sarah heard nothing except the memory of engine noise and wind. "You're quiet tonight, sweetheart," her mother observed. "Everything okay at the airport?" Sarah looked up, meeting her parents' concerned gazes. How could she explain what had happened? How could she describe the moment when everything clicked into place, when she realized that flying wasn't just something she wanted to do, it was something she had to do? "I think I know what I want to be when I grow up," Sarah said quietly. Her father set down his fork. "Engineering school applications are a pilot," Sarah interrupted, the words tumbling out with newfound certainty. "I want to be a pilot, not just any pilot, a military pilot. I want to fly fighter jets." The silence that followed felt heavier than the July air outside. Her parents exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the worry creeping into their expressions. "Honey," her mother said gently, "that's a lovely dream, but it's not a dream," Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "It's a plan." That night, alone in her bedroom, Sarah stared at the ceiling and replayed every second of her first flight. She could still feel the controls in her hands, still remember the moment when the earth fell away and she became one with the sky. Tomorrow, she'd ask Pete to teach her more. She'd study everything she could about aviation, about the military, about what it took to earn wings of gold. Her classmates might think she was crazy. Her parents might worry she was setting herself up for disappointment. But Sarah Chun had tasted freedom at 3,000 feet, and she knew with absolute certainty that she'd do whatever it took to get back there. The girl who flew with ghosts had found her calling among the clouds. The Rocky Mountains loomed like granite sentinels beyond the pristine grounds of the United States Air Force Academy, their snow-capped peaks catching the first light of dawn as Sarah Chun stepped off the bus with 49 other incoming cadets. Colorado Springs felt like another planet compared to the endless flatlands of Nebraska. Here, everything was bigger, sharper, more intense, from the mountain scenery to the razor-sharp creases in every uniform she saw. "Welcome to Hell Week, maggots." The training instructor's voice cut through the crisp morning air like a blade. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stood ramrod straight, his chest decorated with enough ribbons and badges to stock a small military museum. His eyes swept across the new arrivals with the predatory focus of a hawk sizing up field mice. "For the next 7 days, you will discover whether you have what it takes to earn the right to call yourselves United States Air Force officers." Sarah shouldered her duffel bag and fell into formation with the other cadets. At 18, she was one of the youngest in her class, and certainly the smallest. Standing barely 5'2" in her regulation boots, she was dwarfed by most of her classmates, many of whom looked like they'd stepped out of a military recruiting poster, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from being the star quarterback or class president back home. The cadet to her left, Morrison, stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who'd spent his high school years in weight rooms and on football fields. He glanced down at Sarah with barely concealed amusement. "You sure you're in the right place, Tiny? The Girl Scout camp is probably down the mountain somewhere." Sarah kept her eyes forward, jaw clenched. She'd heard variations of that joke her entire life. In high school, guidance counselors had gently suggested she consider more realistic career paths. Her physics teacher had praised her aptitude, but wondered aloud whether she'd considered engineering instead of aviation. Even Pete Henderson, despite his gruff encouragement, had once muttered something about the military being no place for little girls with big dreams. But Sarah had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. While her classmates partied on weekends, she'd run 5 miles every morning before school. While they slept in during summer vacations, she'd been doing push-ups and sit-ups in her parents' garage. She'd memorized every regulation in the cadet handbook, studied military history until she could recite famous battles from memory, and maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA through sheer determination. The first few weeks at the academy were a blur of inspections, marching drills, and academic classes that would have challenged graduate students. Sarah excelled in her coursework aerodynamics, physics, military strategy, but struggled with some of the physical demands. The obstacle course left her gasping, while her male classmates jogged through it with apparent ease. During combat training exercises, she was frequently overpowered by opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. "Chun!" Sergeant Rodriguez barked during a particularly brutal fitness assessment. "You're falling behind again. Drop and give me 20. Sarah hit the ground and cranked out 20 perfect push-ups, ignoring the snickers from nearby cadets. She'd learned not to show weakness, not to let them see her frustration. Every failure was ammunition they could use against her, every sign of struggle proof that she didn't belong. Her roommate, Janet Walsh from Texas, tried to be supportive. "Don't let them get to you," she said one evening as Sarah nursed sore muscles and wounded pride. "Half these guys are just trying to prove something to themselves." "Easy for you to say," Sarah replied, not looking up from her calculus homework. "You're not the one they call fun size during formation." But Sarah had all eyes too. Captain Martinez, her aerodynamics instructor, was a former F-16 pilot who'd flown combat missions over Iraq. She was one of only a handful of female officers at the academy, and she seemed to recognize something in Sarah's quiet determination. "Physics doesn't care how tall you are, Cadet Chun," Captain Martinez said after class one day, reviewing Sarah's perfect test scores. "An F-16 responds to skill and intelligence, not muscle mass. Remember that." The turning point came during a simulated dogfight exercise in the Academy's flight training program. Cadets took turns in advanced simulators that replicated the experience of flying modern fighter aircraft. Most of Sarah's classmates approached the exercise like a video game, relying on aggressive tactics and brute force maneuvering. Sarah approached it like chess. She studied her opponent's patterns, identified their weaknesses, and used precision flying to outmaneuver aircraft that should have dominated her in a straight fight. While Morrison and his crew tried to overpower their virtual enemies, Sarah used superior positioning and tactical thinking to achieve victory after victory. How the hell did she do that? One cadet muttered after Sarah's simulator had shot down 3 opponents in a single engagement. "Beginner's luck," Morrison replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The call sign ceremony arrived during their second year, a tradition that was part celebration, part hazing ritual. Each cadet would receive a nickname that would follow them throughout their Air Force career, if they made it that far. The ceremony took place in Mitchell Hall, the Academy's massive dining facility, with the entire sophomore class gathered around circular tables, laden with barely edible cafeteria food and warm beer smuggled in by upperclassmen. Senior cadets took turns announcing call signs, usually based on memorable incidents, personality quirks, or physical characteristics. Diesel got his name after falling asleep during a chemistry lab and snoring like a freight train. Ghost earned his moniker by disappearing during room inspections. Bulldog looked exactly like his namesake and had the temperament to match. When they called Sarah's name, the room fell quiet with anticipation. Everyone knew she was different. This small-town girl who'd somehow clawed her way to the middle of their class rankings despite every physical disadvantage. Some cadets respected her determination. Others resented her success. Most were simply curious to see how the upperclassmen would brand her. "Cadet Chun," announced Tyler Viper Thompson, a senior with a reputation for creative cruelty. "Your call sign reflects your ambitious nature and your impressive stature." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. "From this day forward, you will be known as Eagle-7. The room erupted in laughter. Eagles were majestic, powerful birds of prey, the symbol of American air power itself. The 7 was a reference to her height, barely over 5 feet in boots. The name was designed to highlight the absurdity of someone so small thinking they could soar with America's finest pilots. Sarah stood at attention, her face betraying no emotion as the laughter washed over her. Inside, she felt the familiar burn of humiliation and anger, but she'd learned to channel those feelings into fuel for her ambition. They thought Eagle-7 was an insult. They thought it highlighted her limitations. They were wrong. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied in a clear, steady voice. "I accept the call sign Eagle-7 with honor." The laughter began to die down as cadets realized she wasn't reacting the way they expected. There was no embarrassment, no shame, just quiet acceptance, and what looked almost like satisfaction. Morrison leaned over to his buddy. "She's delusional, if she thinks that's a compliment." But Captain Martinez, observing from the back of the room, smiled slightly. She'd seen that look before, the expression of someone who'd just been underestimated and was already planning to prove everyone wrong. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow dormitory bed, staring at the ceiling and repeating her new call sign in her mind. Eagle-7. They meant it as a joke, a constant reminder that she was too small, too ambitious, too different to belong in their world. But eagles didn't apologize for their size. They used their intelligence, their precision, their refusal to quit. They soared higher than any other bird, not because they were the biggest or strongest, but because they refused to accept limitations. Eagle-7. She could live with that. In fact, she was going to make them remember it. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac at Shepherd Air Force Base, turning the concrete into a shimmering furnace that radiated heat waves like liquid mercury. Second Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood in the shadow of her T-38 Talon, running through her pre-flight checklist for what felt like the 100th time that week. The sleek white trainer aircraft gleamed in the afternoon light, its needle nose and swept wings promising speeds that would have been impossible to imagine back in Pete Henderson's dusty Cessna. Eagle-7, you ready for another ride on the Vomit? Comet? Called out Lieutenant Jake Torch Williams from the neighboring aircraft. At 6'2", with the cocky grin of someone who'd never met a challenge he couldn't overcome, Torch represented everything Sarah was up against in undergraduate pilot training. He'd graduated from the academy 2 years ahead of her, sailed through primary flight training, and seemed to treat supersonic flight like an amusement park ride. Sarah didn't respond, focusing instead on checking her oxygen connections and adjusting her helmet. 3 weeks into advanced jet training, and she was still fighting the same battle she'd faced since day one, proving she belonged in a cockpit designed for someone twice her size, flying missions that pushed human physiology to its absolute limits. The T-38 cockpit was cramped even for average-sized pilots, but for Sarah, it felt like trying to operate a machine built for giants. Her feet barely reached the rudder pedals, even with the seat adjusted to its highest position. The control stick required her to stretch uncomfortably, and the ejection seat seemed to swallow her small frame. Worse, the physical demands of high-performance flight were taking a toll that her male classmates simply didn't experience. Pre-flight complete. She radioed to her instructor, Major Rick Hawkeye Patterson, who occupied the rear seat of the tandem cockpit. Patterson was a veteran F-16 pilot with over 2,000 hours of combat flying time and the patience of someone who'd seen every type of student pilot imaginable. He'd been assigned to Sarah's training specifically because of his reputation for getting struggling pilots through the program, though Sarah wasn't sure if that was a vote of confidence or a subtle message about her prospects. Roger that, Eagle-7. Today we're working on defensive maneuvering against simulated surface-to-air missiles. You'll need to pull some serious G's to defeat the threats, so make sure you're ready for it. Patterson's voice crackled through the intercom with professional detachment, but Sarah detected a note of concern. Her previous flights had been technically proficient, but lacked the aggressive edge that separated adequate pilots from great ones. The T-38's twin engines spooled up with a whining roar as Sarah advanced the throttles. The aircraft rolled forward, vibrating with barely contained power. At the end of the runway, she ran through the final checks, her hands moving with the precision she'd developed through countless hours of study and practice. Shepherd Tower, Eagle-7 flight ready for departure, she radioed. Eagle-7 flight cleared for takeoff. Winds 180 at 15, gusts to 22. Sarah pushed the throttles to full power and released the brakes. The T-38 shot forward like a rocket, pressing her back into her seat as the airspeed indicator climbed through 100, 120, 150 knots. At 160 knots, she pulled back on the stick and felt the familiar miracle of flight as the main gear lifted off the runway. But today felt different. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Sarah's stomach began the familiar churning that had plagued her for weeks. The combination of rapid altitude changes, aggressive maneuvering, and the stress of constant evaluation was wearing her down physically and mentally. She'd lost 8 pounds since arriving at Shepherd, and her sleep was constantly interrupted by anxiety dreams about failing out of the program. All right, Eagle-7, let's start with some basic defensive turns, Patterson instructed. As they reached their training area, I'll call out simulated missile launches, and you execute evasive maneuvers. Remember, in the real world, hesitation equals death. Roger, Sarah replied, gripping the stick tighter. Missile launch, 3 o'clock, Patterson barked. Sarah yanked the stick hard right and pulled back, sending the T-38 into a punishing 6G turn. The force slammed her down into her seat like a giant's fist, making her arms feel like lead weights and causing her vision to narrow at the edges. The anti-G suit inflated around her legs and abdomen, helping to keep blood from pooling away from her brain, but the physical stress was enormous. "Not aggressive enough," Patterson shouted over the engine noise. "You're dead. A real Sam would have nailed you." Again, Sarah leveled the aircraft and tried to shake off the nausea building in her stomach. Through the canopy, she could see Torch's T-38 executing the same maneuvers with apparent ease, pulling even harder Gs while maintaining perfect formation with his instructor. Missile launch, 6 o'clock low. This time Sarah hauled back on the stick even harder, pulling the aircraft into a climb so steep it felt like riding an elevator to heaven. 7 Gs pressed her into her seat, and her vision began to gray out as blood drained from her brain, despite the anti-G suit's best efforts. The horizon disappeared in a haze of physical distress, but she held the turn, fighting against the urge to ease off the pressure. "Better, but still not good enough," Patterson called. "In combat, you need to be willing to take it to the edge of consciousness. The missile doesn't care if you're uncomfortable." For the next hour, they repeated the exercise again and again. Simulated missile launches came from every direction, high, low, left, right, each requiring a different defensive response. Sarah's technique improved gradually, but her physical condition deteriorated with each aggressive maneuver. Sweat poured down her face inside her helmet, and her stomach churned with increasing violence. Missile launch, 12 o'clock high. Sarah pulled into a diving turn that loaded the aircraft with 8 Gs more than she'd ever experienced. The world went gray, then black around the edges as tunnel vision set in. Her arms felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds each, and maintaining control of the stick required every ounce of strength she possessed. The nausea that had been building all afternoon finally overwhelmed her defenses. "I'm going to be sick," she gasped over the intercom. "Negative, Eagle-7. Fight through it. Level off and maintain control." Sarah forced herself to ease back on the stick, leveling the aircraft as her vision slowly returned. The nausea was overwhelming now, and she could taste bile in the back of her throat. Around her, the cockpit seemed to spin, despite the fact that the aircraft was flying straight and level. "I need to return to base," she said weakly. "Eagle-7. Patterson's voice carried a note of disappointment that cut deeper than any direct criticism. "You can't quit every time things get uncomfortable. Maybe try a gentler approach next time." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A gentler approach. Translation: maybe you're not cut out for this. Maybe you should consider transport aircraft, or better yet, a nice desk job somewhere safe and predictable. As they flew back toward Shepherd, Sarah stared out at the endless Texas landscape and felt the weight of 3 weeks' worth of barely controlled fear and frustration finally crashed down on her. Every flight had been a struggle. Every landing had been criticized. Every maneuver had been judged inadequate by instructors who seemed increasingly convinced that Eagle-7 was a mistake waiting to be corrected. Back on the ground, Sarah climbed out of the cockpit on unsteady legs and removed her helmet with shaking hands. Torch was already out of his aircraft, laughing with his instructor about some joke she hadn't heard. He caught sight of Sarah's pale complexion and green-tinged face. "Rough flight, Eagle-7?" he called with mock sympathy. "Maybe you should stick to flying cargo planes. Less aggressive maneuvering." Sarah ignored him and walked toward the squadron building, each step requiring conscious effort. In the locker room, she sat on a bench and put her head in her hands, fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion. 3 weeks of this, and she felt like she was going backward instead of forward. That evening, She called her parents from the pay phone outside her dormitory. Her mother's voice, warm and concerned, nearly broke her resolve to stay strong. "How is the flying going, sweetheart?" "It's challenging," Sarah replied, which was the understatement of the century. "Your father wants to know if you're eating enough. He says pilots need to stay strong." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Staying strong was exactly the problem. She was strong enough academically, strong enough mentally, but the physical demands of high-performance flight seemed designed to defeat someone with her body type. After hanging up, she walked back to her room and pulled out her flight training manual. If gentleness was what they expected from her, then she'd prove them wrong. If they thought Eagle-7 couldn't handle the pressure, she'd show them what pressure really looked like. She studied until 2 a.m., memorizing every defensive maneuver, every optimal G-loading technique, every method for maintaining consciousness under extreme acceleration. When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of flying, not the gentle soaring of her Nebraska days, but the violent, precise ballet of aerial combat. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Eagle-7 would find her edge. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions from Nellis Air Force Base, a moonscape of sagebrush and alkali flats that made Nebraska's farmland look like paradise. Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood at attention in the 414th Fighter Squadrons briefing room, her brand-new wings gleaming on her chest as Colonel Marcus Bulldog Thompson looked her up and down with the expression of a man who just discovered a rattlesnake in his lunchbox. "So you're Eagle-7," Thompson said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent 30 years breathing jet exhaust and desert dust. Behind him, the squadron's patch displayed a snarling wolf's head with the motto "Death from Above" embroidered in gold thread. "I've read your training reports. Technically proficient, they say. Good academic scores. Adequate stick and rudder skills." Sarah kept her eyes forward, recognizing the colonel's careful word choice. In military parlance, adequate was barely. A step above, dangerous. And technically proficient meant you could fly without crashing, but lacked the killer instinct that separated competent pilots from warriors. "The thing is, Eagle-7," Thompson continued, walking slowly around her like a predator circling prey, "this isn't flight school anymore. The 414th flies real missions with real consequences. We provide close air support for ground troops in harm's way. We intercept enemy aircraft that want to kill Americans. We drop bombs on targets that, if we miss, might cost soldiers' lives." The briefing room fell silent, except for the distant whine of F-16s taking off from the main runway. Sarah could feel the eyes of her new squadron mates boring into her 12 male pilots, ranging in age from 23 to 38, all of whom had earned their place through years of training, and in some cases, combat experience. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Thompson stopped directly in front of her. "The question is whether someone who needed remedial training in defensive maneuvering has what it takes to fly with the wolf pack. What do you think, Eagle-7?" The silence stretched like a taut wire. Sarah knew this was more than a question. It was a test. Show weakness now, and she'd spend her entire tour fighting for respect she'd never earned. But push back too hard, and she'd be labeled as insubordinate and difficult. "I think I'm here to learn from the best, sir," she said finally, "and to prove I belong." A few pilots exchanged glances. Captain Ryan Viper Morrison, no relation to her academy tormentor, smirked from his seat in the back row. At 28, he was the squadron's youngest flight leader and its most vocal skeptic about women in combat roles. "Well," Thompson said, "we'll see about that. Viper, you're her mentor. Show Eagle-7 the ropes. Try not to get her killed in the first week." The dismissal was clear. As the other pilots filed out for their afternoon sorties, Sarah remained at attention until Thompson waved her away with obvious disinterest. She followed Viper out of the briefing room, noting how the other pilots gave her a wide berth, as if inexperience might be contagious. "So, Eagle-7, Viper said as they walked toward the squadron's operations center. "Let me guess. Top of your class at the academy. Model student in flight training. Probably never got anything less than an A in your entire life." "Something like that," Sarah replied carefully. "Yeah, that's what I figured." See, the thing about book learning is that it doesn't mean shit when you're pulling 6 Gs with a MiG on your tail. Out here, we care about one thing. Can you hack it when the shooting starts? The operations center buzzed with activity as pilots planned missions, reviewed intelligence reports, and prepared for sorties across the vast Nevada test and training range. Sarah tried to absorb everything radio frequencies, weapons configurations, threat assessments, but the information flow was overwhelming. "Your first week, you'll be flying training missions," Viper explained, pointing to a schedule board covered in magnetic strips representing aircraft and pilot assignments. Basic air-to-air combat, ground attack profiles, emergency procedures. Nothing too exciting. We need to see what you can actually do before we trust you with anything important. Sarah noticed her name appeared only on the most routine assignments, functional check flights, navigation training, basic maneuvers practice. Meanwhile, the experienced pilots were scheduled for red flag exercises, combat training missions. That simulated real warfare against sophisticated enemy forces. "When do I get to participate in red flag?" she asked. Viper laughed. "Red flag? Eagle-7, you need to prove you can handle a basic BFM engagement before we let you play with the big boys. Red flag is where we prepare for actual combat. It's not a place for—" He paused, searching for the right words. "For someone like me?" Sarah finished. "For someone unproven," Viper corrected, though his meaning was clear. That afternoon, Sarah's first flight with the squadron was a sobering reminder of how much she still had to learn. Flying formation with Captain Dave "Hawk" Rodriguez, a quiet professional with over 1,500 hours in the F-16, she struggled to maintain precise positioning as they maneuvered through the desert landscape at 500 feet and 400 knots. "Eagle-7, you're drifting wide," Rodriguez's voice crackled through her headset. "Close it up. In combat, loose formation gets people killed." Sarah made the correction, nudging her F-16 closer to Rodriguez's aircraft until their wingtips were separated by mere feet. The margin for error at these speeds was measured in milliseconds, and any mistake could result in a mid-air collision that would kill them both instantly. They practiced basic maneuvers, turns, climbs, descents, but even these simple exercises revealed Sarah's inexperience. Her control inputs were tentative where they should have been aggressive, cautious where they should have been confident. Rodriguez provided patient instruction, but Sarah could hear the disappointment in his voice. "You're flying like you're afraid of the airplane," he said as they headed back to base. "The F-16 responds to confidence. If you're not willing to push it to its limits, it'll never perform to yours." Back on the ground, Sarah performed her post-flight inspection with meticulous care, checking every panel and component as she'd been taught. She was alone on the flight line, the other pilots having long since completed their missions and headed to the squadron bar for their traditional debrief sessions. As she finished her inspection, she noticed something tucked into the cockpit, a small pink object that definitely didn't belong on a military aircraft. Pulling it out, Sarah discovered a Barbie doll dressed in a miniature flight suit, complete with tiny wings and a helmet. Attached was a note written in block letters, "Your real ride." The message was clear. This was what her squadron mates thought of her, a little girl playing dress-up in a world meant for real warriors. Sarah stared at the doll for a long moment, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation and anger that had followed her from Nebraska to Colorado to Texas and now to Nevada. But instead of throwing the doll away or reporting the incident, Sarah did something unexpected. She carefully placed it in her flight bag and carried it back to her quarters. That evening, she positioned the doll on her desk where she could see it while studying aircraft manuals and tactical procedures. Let them think she was a joke. Let them assume she'd wash out like so many others before her. Sarah had learned long ago that underestimation was a weapon she could turn to her advantage. Over the following weeks, the pranks continued. Someone reprogrammed her radio to play children's songs during pre-flight checks. Her helmet was filled with shaving cream. Anonymous notes appeared in her mailbox questioning whether she'd be better suited for transport aircraft or desk jobs. The betting pool on her longevity reached $800, with most money placed on her washing out within 6 months. Captain Diesel Jackson held the most optimistic position, betting she'd last a full year before requesting a transfer to a less demanding assignment. But Sarah ignored the games and focused on flying. She studied tactics manuals until 2 a.m., memorized every emergency procedure, and volunteered for the worst assignments: night flights in bad weather, equipment test missions, and solo navigation exercises that other pilots avoided. Gradually, incrementally, her performance improved. Her formation flying became precise and confident. Her weapons delivery scores moved from adequate to proficient. Most importantly, she stopped flying like she was afraid of the aircraft and started flying like she owned it. The turning point came during a particularly challenging air-to-air combat training mission. Sarah was paired against Captain Torch Williams, the same pilot who tormented her during advanced training in a simulated dogfight over the Nevada desert. Torch expected an easy victory. Sarah was still the squadron's newest pilot, still unproven in air-to-air combat, still flying with the cautious precision of someone afraid to make mistakes. But Sarah had been studying Torch's techniques, analyzing his patterns, identifying his weaknesses. When the fight began, she didn't try to match his aggressive style. Instead, she used patience, positioning, and precise timing to turn his strengths against him. The engagement lasted 12 minutes, an eternity in air-to-air combat, before Sarah achieved a simulated kill with a perfectly timed missile shot. "How the hell did you do that?" Torch demanded over the radio, his voice a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. "I've been watching and learning," Sarah replied simply. That evening, for the first time since arriving at Nellis, Sarah was invited to join the informal debrief session at the squadron bar. The invitation came from Rodriguez, who'd been quietly observing her progress. "You might actually hack it out here, Eagle-7, he said, raising his beer in a small salute. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the squadron's unwanted guest was becoming something more. The alert klaxon's piercing wail shattered the pre-dawn silence at Nellis Air Force Base like a banshee's scream, jolting Lieutenant Sarah Chun from the first deep sleep she'd managed in weeks. Red warning lights strobed through the squadron dormitory windows as the base's emergency broadcast system crackled to life. "All pilots report to the briefing room immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Sarah's feet hit the cold linoleum floor before her brain fully processed what was happening. Around her, other pilots were already pulling on flight suits and grabbing gear with the practiced efficiency of warriors who'd trained for this moment their entire careers. Captain Hawk Rodriguez was lacing his boots with mechanical precision, his face grim in the red emergency lighting. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked, struggling into her flight suit while trying to shake off the fog of interrupted sleep. "Don't know yet," Rodriguez replied, checking his watch. "But the last time they pulled a 0500 scramble was during the Gulf War buildup. This isn't a training exercise." The squadron briefing room buzzed with controlled chaos as pilots filed in, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and professional concern. Colonel Thompson stood at the front of the room beside a large projection screen displaying a map of Eastern Europe, his expression more serious than Sarah had ever seen it. Behind him, intelligence officers shuffled through classified folders, while communications specialists monitored multiple radio frequencies. "Gentlemen," Thompson began, his gravelly voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "And lady," he added with a slight nod toward Sarah. At 2,300 hours Eastern European time, Russian aircraft began probing NATO airspace along the Polish and Lithuanian borders. What started as routine harassment has escalated into something much more serious. The map on the screen zoomed in to show the Baltic region, with red symbols indicating Russian aircraft movements and blue symbols marking NATO response positions. Sarah studied the display with growing unease, recognizing the tactical significance of what she was seeing. As of 1 hour ago, Thompson continued, Russian forces have moved advanced surface-to-air missile systems to within 50 kilometers of the Polish border. Intelligence indicates they're preparing for what they're calling defensive exercises. But the positioning suggests offensive capabilities. Captain Viper Morrison raised his hand. "Sir, what's our role in this?" Thompson clicked to the next slide, revealing deployment orders with the 414th Fighter Squadron's Wolf Head logo prominently displayed. Effective immediately, we're deploying to Łask Air Base in central Poland as part of NATO's Rapid Response Force. We'll be providing air superiority and close air support for allied forces in the region. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Poland was less than 200 miles from the current Russian positions. This wasn't a distant conflict or a training deployment. This was the real thing, with real missiles and real consequences. "Sir," asked Captain Diesel Jackson, "what's the threat assessment?" "High," Thompson replied without hesitation. Russian forces include advanced fighter Su-35s, MiG-31s, along with state-of-the-art surface-to-air missile systems. They're not playing games this time. Neither are we. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the briefing continued. Intelligence? Reports painted a picture of rapidly escalating tensions, with both sides moving military assets into position for what could become the first major confrontation between NATO and Russian forces since the Cold War. Deployment begins in 18 hours, Thompson announced. We'll fly our aircraft directly to Poland, with aerial refueling over the Atlantic. Maintenance crews and support personnel will follow via transport aircraft. Once we're established, at Łask, we'll be under the operational control of NATO Air Command. The colonel's eyes swept across the room, stopping briefly on each pilot. I want to be clear about something. This isn't a peacekeeping mission or a show of force. Russian fighters have already violated NATO airspace twice in the past 12 hours. The next time they cross that line, we'll be there to meet them. As the briefing broke up into smaller planning sessions, Sarah found herself assigned to a team responsible for reviewing aircraft weapons configurations and mission profiles. The technical discussions were sobering discussions of beyond visual range, missile engagements, electronic warfare capabilities, and rules of engagement that could mean the difference between deterrence and all-out war. Eagle-7, Rodriguez called as she studied a tactical manual. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah looked up from the pages detailing AIM-120 missile employment procedures. "Just trying to process everything. 6 months ago, I was flying training missions over the Nevada desert. Now we're talking about potential air-to-air combat against Russian fighters." "Welcome to the big leagues," Rodriguez said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "The thing is, all that training, the formation flying, the air-to-air tactics, the weapons employment, it all matters now. Every lesson you learned, every mistake you made and corrected, It's all been preparing you for this moment. Over the next 18 hours, Nellis Air Force Base transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Aircraft were loaded with live weapons. Instead of training rounds, intelligence officers briefed pilots on Russian aircraft capabilities and tactics. Maintenance crews performed exhaustive inspections to ensure every system was operating perfectly. Sarah spent the time meticulously reviewing her aircraft's configuration, checking and double-checking every switch, every circuit breaker, every piece of equipment. Her F-16C was loaded with a full complement of air-to-air missiles, 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders for close-range engagements, and 4 AIM-12OC AMRAMs for beyond visual range shots. The aircraft also carried a full load of 20mm cannon ammunition and electronic countermeasures equipment. "Nervous?" asked Captain Torch Williams, the same pilot she defeated in air-to-air training just weeks earlier. His attitude toward her had shifted noticeably since that engagement, moving from open disdain to grudging respect. "Focused," Sarah replied, continuing her pre-flight inspection. "This is what we trained for." "Yeah, but training and the real thing are different animals," Torch said, settling into a more serious tone. "Out there, the missiles are real, the bullets are real, and the guy trying to kill you is just as well trained as you are." As departure time approached, the squadron gathered for a final briefing. Thompson stood before them in full flight gear, his expression reflecting the gravity of their mission. "In 30 minutes, we launch for Poland," he announced. "Once we're wheels up, we're committed to this deployment until the situation resolves one way or another. Some of you have combat experience. Others are facing this for the first time." His eyes found Sarah in the group. "Remember your training. Trust your wingman. Follow your orders. And bring everyone home." The walk to the aircraft felt surreal. Sarah had made the same walk hundreds of times during training, but the weight of live weapons and the knowledge that she might actually use them changed everything. Her F-16 sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its sleek lines and deadly payload representing the cutting edge of American air power. As she climbed into the cockpit, Sarah caught sight of the small Barbie doll she still kept in her flight. Bagged the same doll that had been left as a cruel joke months earlier. Now it seemed like a reminder of how far she'd come, how much she'd proved to herself and others. "Eagle-7 radio check," crackled through her headset. "Eagle-7, loud and clear," she responded, her voice steady and professional. Around her, 11. Other F-16s were starting their engines, the whine of turbines building to a crescendo that echoed across the Nevada desert. In minutes, they would be airborne, heading east toward an uncertain future where her training would be tested against the harsh realities of international conflict. Sarah completed her engine start checklist with practiced efficiency. Each switch, position and instrument reading committed to memory through countless repetitions. But as she waited for taxi clearance, she allowed herself one moment of reflection. 6 months ago, her squadron mates had seen her as an unwanted guest, a diversity experiment that would wash out at the first real challenge. The betting pool on her longevity had reached nearly $1,000, with most money placed on failure. Now she was sitting in a fighter aircraft, loaded with live weapons, preparing to deploy to a potential combat zone as a trusted member of one of the Air Force's most elite squadrons. The girl from rural Nebraska, who'd learned to fly in a crop duster, was about to face her ultimate test. "Wolfpack flight, taxi for departure," came the tower's voice. Sarah released her brakes and followed the formation toward the runway, knowing that when she returned to this base, if she returned, nothing would ever be the same. The Polish countryside rolled beneath Sarah's F-16 like a patchwork quilt of emerald fields and dark forests, peaceful and serene in the early morning light. But the tranquility was deceptive. Somewhere beyond the eastern horizon Russian fighters were probing NATO airspace with increasing boldness, testing the alliance's resolve with each unauthorized border crossing. Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her grip on the control stick and checked her instruments for the dozenth time in 10 minutes. 3 weeks into the deployment at Wask Air Base, the 414th Fighter Squadron had settled into a routine of constant readiness pilots rotating through alert status, aircraft loaded with live weapons, everyone waiting for the call that would transform training into reality. Eagle-7, this is Razor 1, crackled Captain Rodriguez's voice through her headset. As flight lead for today's combat air patrol, Rodriguez had been Sarah's mentor and wingman throughout the deployment. Check your weapons status and confirm ready for tasking. Sarah glanced at her armament panel, verifying that her 4AIM-120C, AMRA-AIMs, and 2 AIM-9X sidewinders were showing green across the board. The 20mm cannon was loaded with 511 rounds of high-explosive ammunition, enough to destroy any aircraft unfortunate enough to cross her path. Razor 1, Eagle-7. All weapons green, ready for tasking, she reported, her voice carrying the professional calm she'd cultivated through months of training and preparation. Copy, Eagle-7. Maintain patrol altitude Angels 25, heading 0-9-0. AWACS reports multiple contacts approaching the fence. The fence was military slang for the invisible line separating NATO airspace from potential hostile territory. For the past week, Russian aircraft had been flying increasingly aggressive patterns near that boundary, sometimes approaching within 5 nautical miles before turning away at the last moment. From her position at 25,000 feet, Sarah could see the curve of the Earth stretching toward Belarus and beyond. Intelligence reports indicated that Russian forces had moved additional fighter squadrons to airfields just across the border Su-35, flankers with advanced radar systems and long-range missiles that could engage NATO aircraft from over 100 miles away. All call signs, this is magic, came the voice of the AWACS controller, the Boeing E-3 Sentry aircraft circling high above the patrol area like an electronic eye in the sky. We have 4 contacts bearing 060, range 80 nautical miles, altitude unknown. Contacts are proceeding westbound at high speed. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, not from fear, but from the controlled adrenaline rush of a predator sensing prey. This was different from the routine probes they'd been monitoring. 4 aircraft at high speed suggested something more serious than reconnaissance. Magic, Razor 1, Rodriguez transmitted. Request positive identification on contacts. Razor 1. Magic. Stand by for correlation. There was a pause as the AWACS crew analyzed their radar returns against known aircraft signatures. Razor 1. Contacts appear consistent with Su-35 flanker. Say again. 4 Su-35 flankers inbound to the fence. Su-35s. Sarah had studied the specifications of Russia's most advanced air superiority fighter until she could recite them from memory. Twin engines, supermaneuverability, advanced radar, and a weapons load that included some of the most sophisticated air-to-air missiles in the world. These weren't training aircraft or obsolete interceptors. These were frontline fighters flown by Russia's best pilots. Razor flight magic. Contacts now bearing 055, range 60 nautical miles. Contacts are maintaining course and speed toward the fence. Sarah checked her radar display, noting the 4 hostile symbols moving steadily westward toward NATO airspace. At their current speed, they would reach the boundary in less than 10 minutes. Standard procedure called for NATO fighters to intercept and escort hostile aircraft away from Allied airspace. But recent intelligence suggested that Russian pilots had been authorized to use more aggressive tactics. Eagle-7, Razor 1, Rodriguez. Called. Move to combat spread and arm your systems. This could get interesting. Sarah immediately maneuvered her F-16 to a position 3 miles abeam of Rodriguez's aircraft, providing mutual support while maintaining enough separation to avoid being targeted by a single enemy missile. She flipped the master arm switch to the arm position and selected her AIM-120C missiles on the weapons control panel. The transformation was immediate and profound. What had been a routine patrol mission suddenly became a potential combat engagement. Every system in her aircraft was now configured for war, every sensor focused on detecting and destroying enemy threats. All calsigns magic. Contacts now bearing 050, range 40 nautical miles. Contacts are maintaining course toward NATO airspace. Sarah could see them now on her radar display, 4 distinct contacts moving in perfect formation toward the invisible line that separated peace from potential conflict. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but the reality was more intense than any simulation. Magic, Razor 1, request rules of engagement clarification. Razor 1. Magic, you are cleared to intercept and escort. Do not fire unless fired upon or unless hostile aircraft cross into NATO airspace and fail to respond to radio warnings. The rules were clear, but left little margin for error. If the Russian fighters crossed the boundary, Sarah and Rodriguez would be authorized to engage. But determining hostile intent in a supersonic encounter that might last only seconds would require split-second decision-making with potentially catastrophic consequences. Contacts now bearing 045, range 20 nautical miles, reported the AWACS controller. All NATO units be advised, contacts are approaching the fence. Sarah's radar locked onto the lead Russian aircraft, her fire control system painting the target with invisible energy while calculating intercept solutions. The Su-35 pilot would know he was being tracked. Modern aircraft carried sophisticated warning systems that detected radar locks, but the game of aerial chicken continued. Razor 1, Eagle-7. Contact, bearing 042, range 15 miles. Angels 30. Multiple contacts in formation. Eagle-7, Razor 1. I have the same picture. Arm your MR aims and prepare for intercept. Sarah selected her beyond visual range missiles and felt the subtle vibration as her aircraft's radar began painting the approaching fighters. The tactical display showed a complex three-dimensional picture of converging aircraft, missile engagement, zones, and the critical fence line that could trigger the first air-to-air combat between NATO and Russian forces since the Cold War. All calsigns magic. Contacts are now 10 nautical miles from the fence, maintaining course and speed. The tension was palpable. In the span of a few minutes, a routine patrol had evolved into a high-stakes confrontation with global implications. Sarah found herself at the center of a crisis that could reshape international relations, and the weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. But as she watched the Russian fighters approach the boundary, Sarah realized something had changed within her. The anxiety and self-doubt that had plagued her since arriving at Nellis had been replaced by cold, professional focus. She wasn't the scared cadet who'd been mocked with the call sign Eagle-7, or the struggling pilot who'd thrown up during high-G training. She was a United States Air Force fighter pilot, armed and ready to defend NATO airspace against any threat. Contacts now 5 nautical miles from the fence, Magic reported. All units stand by. Sarah's finger hovered over the missile release button as she tracked the lead Russian fighter. In a few seconds, those aircraft would either turn away or cross into NATO airspace, forcing her to make decisions that could start a war or save lives. Eagle-7, Razor 1, Rodriguez called, his voice tight with concentration. If they cross the fence, you take the trailer. I'll engage the lead. Razor 1, Eagle-7, Roger. I have the trailer. The Russian formation was now clearly visible on radar. 4 distinct contacts approaching the invisible line that separated 2 different worlds. Sarah's training had brought her to this moment, but training couldn't predict what would happen next. What she did know was that Eagle-7 was ready for whatever came next. Contacts now 2 nautical miles from the fence, Magic announced. All units stand by for potential hostile action. Sarah tightened her grip on the control stick and prepared to make history. Contacts have crossed the fence. Repeat, contacts have crossed into NATO airspace. The AWACS controller's voice cut through the radio static with crystalline urgency as 4 Russian Su-35 flankers violated the invisible boundary that had kept Europe peaceful for decades. Lieutenant Sarah Chon felt time compress into a tunnel of pure focus as her F-16's radar warning receiver erupted in a symphony of electronic alerts. The lead Russian fighter had locked onto Captain Rodriguez's aircraft with targeting radar, while the trailing Su-35 was painting her own jet with a deadly embrace of fire control systems. Razor 1, Bandit has spike, deploying chaff. Rodriguez's transmission was tight with controlled aggression as his aircraft began evasive maneuvers, dispensing clouds of metallic chaff to confuse incoming missiles. Sarah's training took over. With mechanical precision, Eagle-7 also spiked, defending. She yanked her F-16 into a hard left turn while simultaneously deploying chaff and flare countermeasures. The Gi forces slammed her into her seat, but this time there was no nausea, no gray out, only the crystalline clarity of combat. Magic Razor 1, bandits are hostile. Requesting permission to engage. Razor 1, Magic, you are cleared hot. Repeat, cleared to engage hostile aircraft. The words that transformed peacekeeping into warfare crackled through Sarah's headset as she rolled inverted and pulled her nose toward the nearest Russian fighter. The Su-35 pilot was good, very good, executing a climbing spiral that would have defeated most NATO pilots. But Sarah had spent months studying Russian tactics, analyzing their strengths and identifying their weaknesses. Eagle-7 Fox 3, she called, launching an AIM-12OC and RAM at the maneuvering Su-35. The missile streaked away from her aircraft at Mach 4, its active radar seeker hunting for the Russian fighter's electronic signature. The enemy pilot immediately went defensive, diving toward the deck while dispensing countermeasures in a desperate attempt to break the missile's lock. Sarah followed him down, her F-16 screaming through the Polish sky at 600 knots as she maneuvered. For a follow-up shot, Eagle-7, your missile is guiding. Rodriguez called over the tactical frequency as he engaged his own target. Stay aggressive. Sarah watched her radar display as the AIM closed the final miles to its target. The Russian pilot was skilled, pulling maximum Gs and using terrain masking to try to defeat the incoming missile. But precision trumped desperation. At a range of half a mile, the AIM's 50-pound warhead detonated in a sphere of white-hot fragmentation that shredded the Su-35's left wing. Eagle-7 Splash 1, Sarah called, watching the Russian fighter roll inverted and begin an uncontrolled descent toward the Polish countryside. She caught a glimpse of the pilot ejecting, his parachute blossoming white against the green farmland below. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining 3 Russian fighters had split into different directions, turning the engagement into a complex 3-dimensional chess match played at supersonic speeds. Sarah rolled hard right to engage a Su-35 that was attempting to bracket Rodriguez from behind. Razor 1, bandit on your 6 o'clock low, she transmitted, even as she locked on to the threat with her remaining AIM. Eagle-7, take the shot. Sarah's second missile launch was textbook perfect, the AIM-RA, unerringly toward the Russian fighter's hot exhaust signature. But this pilot was ready for it, executing a last-second notch maneuver that caused the missile to lose lock and streak harmlessly past his aircraft. "Damn, missed," Sarah muttered, selecting her sidewinders for close-range engagement. The Su-35 pilot, apparently thinking he'd gained the upper hand, reversed toward Sarah's F-16 in an attempt to achieve a head-on missile shot. It was a fatal mistake. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this kind of aggressive move, having studied dozens of Russian pilot profiles during her deployment preparation. Instead of turning away from the oncoming fighter, the natural instinct for most pilots, Sarah did something completely unexpected. She flew directly toward the Su-35 at a closure rate exceeding 1,200 knots, waiting until the last possible second before launching an AIM-9X Sidewinder at point-blank range. The Russian pilot never had a chance to react. The heat-seeking missile covered the quarter-mile distance in less than a second. Its infrared seeker locked onto the Su-35's twin engines. The explosion was immediate and devastating, turning 40,000 pounds of sophisticated fighter aircraft into an expanding ball of orange flame and twisted metal. "Eagle-7, splash 2, Sarah called, pulling hard to avoid debris from the destroyed aircraft. "Nice shooting, Eagle-7. Rodriguez responded, his own engagement having resulted in a third Russian fighter destroyed. One bandit remaining, heading east at high speed. Sarah checked her radar and spotted the final Su-35 racing back toward Russian airspace at maximum afterburner, apparently having lost his appetite for combat after watching 3 wingmen destroyed. In the span of 4 minutes, Magic Razor 1. 3 bandits destroyed, 1 egressing to the east. Requesting pursuit authorization. Razor 1, Magic, negative on pursuit. Return to patrol station and maintain cap. Outstanding work." As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah found herself alone in the cockpit with the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had engaged in air-to-air combat against Russian fighters, the first such engagement between NATO and Russian forces since the Cold War. More importantly, she had not only survived but excelled, shooting down 2 enemy aircraft. In her first real combat, the radio crackled with congratulations from other NATO flights in the area, pilots who had monitored the engagement and witnessed Eagle-7's performance. But the transmission that meant the most came from an unexpected source. "Eagle-7, this is Magic Actual." It was the voice of the AWACS mission commander, a full colonel with over 3,000 hours of combat experience, outstanding airmanship, and weapons employment. "That was some of the finest flying we've seen in 20 years. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. As they flew back toward Wask Air Base, Rodriguez moved his F-16 into close formation with Sarah's aircraft. Through the canopy, she could see him giving her a thumbs-up gesture, the universal pilot signal for approval and respect. "Eagle-7, Rodriguez called over the radio. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." The landing at Wask was surreal. Ground crews lined the taxiway, having monitored the engagement on radio, and Sarah could see personnel pointing at her aircraft as she rolled toward the parking area. 2 red stars painted below her cockpit rail marked her aerial victories, symbols that would remain with the aircraft forever as testament to this day's events. Colonel Thompson was waiting as Sarah shut down her engines and began her post-flight inspection. His expression was unreadable as she climbed down from the cockpit, but when he spoke, his voice carried a note of something she'd never heard before: genuine respect. "Eagle-7, he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "You've just made Air Force history. First confirmed air-to-air kills by a female pilot in over a decade, and you did it against some of Russia's best equipment and pilots." News of the engagement spread quickly through NATO channels. Within hours, Sarah found herself fielding phone calls from Air Force leadership, intelligence officers wanting detailed debriefs, and media representatives seeking interviews. But the call that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Eagle-7, this is Viper. It was her old nemesis from the academy, now stationed at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Just wanted to say congratulations. You've made all of us proud. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters at WASC, trying to process the day's events. The small Barbie doll that had started as a cruel joke now sat on her desk beside two formal commendation letters, one from NATO Air Command and another from the Pentagon. The transformation seemed impossible, from small-town Nebraska girl to combat veteran in the span of a few years. But as she looked out the window at her F-16 silhouetted against the Polish sunset, Sarah realized that the transformation had been gradual, built through thousands of hours of training, study, and determination. The call sign that had once mocked her ambitions was now spoken with reverence throughout NATO air forces. Eagle-7 had finally earned her wings, not through politics or quotas, but through skill, courage, and an unwavering refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to prove herself. But today, Sarah Chun could honestly say she belonged among the world's finest pilots. The Eagle had learned to soar. The morning sun cast long shadows across the runway at Nellis Air Force Base as Major Sarah Chun walked toward the flight line for what would be her final flight as an operational pilot. 6 months had passed since the engagement over Poland. That made international headlines and transformed Eagle-7 from a mocking nickname into a symbol, recognized throughout the military aviation community. Now, with oak leaves newly pinned to her shoulders and orders to the prestigious test pilot school in her briefcase, Sarah was closing one chapter of her career to begin another. The F-16 waiting for her was not the same aircraft she'd flown into combat. That fighter now resided in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, its nose adorned with 2 red stars and a bronze plaque, commemorating the first female pilot to achieve aerial victories in modern NATO operations. This morning's aircraft wore different markings, the gold and black checkerboard pattern of the 414th Fighter Squadron's weapons school, where Sarah had spent the past 4 months as an instructor pilot. "Morning, Major," called Captain Jennifer Phoenix Martinez as she approached with her own flight gear. At 24, Martinez was one of the newest graduates of undergraduate pilot training, assigned to Sarah's advanced tactics course after specifically requesting to fly with the legendary Eagle-7. "Ready for one last lesson before you abandon U.S. for the test pilot world?" Sarah smiled, adjusting the fit of her helmet. The past months had brought a steady stream of young female pilots seeking mentorship from the woman who'd proven that excellence knew no gender boundaries. Each conversation reminded her of her own struggles and the importance of opening doors for others to follow. "Just remember," Sarah said, reviewing Martinez's flight plan, "aggressive doesn't mean reckless. Every maneuver should have a purpose. Every engagement should have an exit strategy. The pilot who wins isn't necessarily the bravest, it's the one who thinks fastest and most clearly." They were joined by Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reaper Davidson, the new squadron commander who'd replaced Thompson after his promotion to full colonel. Davidson was a combat veteran with experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he'd made it clear from his first day that Eagle-7's reputation preceded her throughout the Air Force. "Major Chun," Davidson said with a formal nod, "I understand this is your final flight with the squadron. I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done here. Your students have consistently outperformed every other training class, and several are already being fast-tracked for advanced assignments." The compliment was genuine, backed by concrete results. Sarah's teaching methods emphasizing tactical thinking over pure aggression, precision over power, had produced a generation of pilots who approached air combat like chess masters rather than berserkers. Her emphasis on studying enemy capabilities and exploiting weaknesses had become standard curriculum at the weapons school. As they completed their pre-flight briefings, Sarah's mind wandered to the events that had brought her to this moment. The phone call from her parents after the Poland engagement had been emotional. Her father finally understanding that his daughter hadn't just chosen a career, she'd found her calling. Her mother had cried with pride, while Pete Henderson, now 81 and still flying his ancient Cessna, had simply said, "Always knew you were born for this, kid." The mission profile for Sarah's final flight was appropriately challenging. A 4-ship formation would engage simulated enemy aircraft in a complex air-to-air scenario designed to test every aspect of modern fighter tactics. Sarah would lead the flight, with Martinez as her wingman and 2 experienced captains completing the formation. Eagle-7 flight, taxi for departure, came the familiar voice from the control tower. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt her F-16 roll forward, the aircraft responding to her touch with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. Behind her, the other 3 fighters followed in perfect formation, their pilots trusting Eagle-7's leadership implicitly. At the end of the runway, Sarah performed her final pre-takeoff checks. Engine parameters were perfect, weapon systems were configured for training mode, and her flight plan was loaded into the navigation computer. Everything was ready for one last dance with the Nevada sky. Nellis Tower, Eagle-7 flight ready for departure. Eagle-7 flight cleared for takeoff. Winds 220 at 12 knots. But instead of the routine clearance she expected, the tower controller continued with words that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Eagle-7, be advised that we have distinguished visitors in the tower today, including the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of Defense. They wanted to personally observe your final flight with the squadron." Sarah keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Tower, Eagle-7 copies. Thank you for the notification." As she pushed the throttles to full power and released the brakes, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small Nebraska airstrip to this moment. The struggles, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, all of it had led to this final flight as an operational pilot. The F-16 accelerated down the runway with familiar authority, and at 150 knots, Sarah pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft lift into the crystalline Nevada sky. The sensation never got old. That moment when Earth's gravity released its hold and she became one with her machine, dancing among the clouds with deadly grace. Eagle-7 flight, contact Nellis approach on 327.15, the tower called. 327.15, Eagle-7. Sarah acknowledged, switching radio frequencies as her formation climbed toward their training area. The air-to-air exercise that followed was a masterpiece of tactical aviation. Sarah's flight engaged 8 simulated enemy aircraft in a complex engagement. It tested every lesson she'd learned over the past 5 years. Her formation used coordinated tactics, superior positioning, and precise weapons employment to achieve a perfect score, all targets destroyed with no losses. "Outstanding work, Eagle-7 flight," came the voice of the range controller as they completed the mission. That was textbook execution from start to finish. As they headed back to base, Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. "Major, that was incredible. I've never seen tactics like that. How did you know the enemy formation would split at that exact moment?" Sarah smiled inside her helmet. "Pattern recognition, Phoenix. Every pilot has tendencies, habits they fall into under pressure. The key is recognizing those patterns and using them against your opponent." The landing at Nellis was ceremonial in nature. Ground crews lined the taxiway, and Sarah could see a small crowd gathered near the squadron building. Other pilots, maintenance personnel, and what appeared to be senior officers in dress uniforms. As Sarah shut down her engines and began her post-flight inspection, she noticed someone waiting beside her aircraft. General Patricia Lightning Rodriguez, no relation to Captain Rodriguez, stood in full dress uniform, her 4 stars gleaming in the afternoon sun. As the first female Chief of Staff of the Air Force, she represented the pinnacle of what was possible for women in military aviation. Major Chun, General Rodriguez said as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, "I wanted to personally congratulate you on an exceptional career as an operational pilot. Your achievements have opened doors and changed perceptions throughout our service." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied, coming to attention. "At ease, Major. I also wanted to inform you that your actions over Poland have been recognized at the highest levels. The President has approved your nomination for the Distinguished Flying Cross with a Valor Device. The ceremony will take place at the White House next month." The news was overwhelming. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the nation's highest decorations for aerial achievement, rarely awarded to pilots who weren't already legendary figures in aviation history. Later that evening, Sarah found herself in the squadron car, surrounded by pilots who had become not just colleagues, but genuine friends. The atmosphere was celebratory, but tinged with sadness. Eagle-7 was moving on to test pilot school, where she would help develop the next generation of fighter aircraft. Captain Martinez approached her with a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Major, when you were struggling during training, when everyone was betting against you, what kept you going?" Sarah considered the question carefully, swirling the ice in her glass of club soda. "I think it was understanding that I wasn't just fighting for myself. Every woman who wants to fly fighters, every person who's been told they're too small or too different or too ambitious, they're all watching. Not because they want to see me fail, but because they need to see that it's possible." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of young pilots who hung on her every word. The call sign Eagle-7 started as an insult, but eagles don't apologize for being eagles. They use their intelligence, their precision, their refusal to accept limitations. They soar not because they're the biggest or strongest, but because they refuse to stay on the ground. As the evening wound down, Sarah walked out to the flight line one last time, approaching the F-16 she'd flown that morning. In the moonlight, the aircraft looked like a sleeping predator, its sleek lines and purposeful design representing the cutting edge of American air power. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter as a test pilot, pushing experimental aircraft to their limits and helping to develop technologies that would keep America's pilots safe in future conflicts. But tonight, she was still Eagle-7, the small-town girl who'd refused to accept that the sky had limits. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her father. "Saw the news about the medal. Your mother and I are proud beyond words. Pete wants to know if you still remember how to fly a Cessna." Sarah smiled, typing back, "Tell Pete I'll always remember where I learned that eagles aren't defined by their size, but by their refusal to stay earthbound." As she walked back toward the squadron building, Sarah could hear the distant sound of night flights taking off from the main runway. Young pilots, learning the same lessons she'd mastered, facing the same challenges she'd overcome. The legacy of Eagle-7 would live on in each of them, a reminder that excellence has no gender, no size requirement, no prerequisites beyond determination and skill. She had taught them that eagles soar not because they're born to fly, but because they refuse to accept any other option.